If I were a crow, or at least had the faculty of flying with that swift directness which is proverbially attributed to the Corvine tribe, and were to wing a southwesterly course from the truck of the flagstaff which arises from the battery at New York, I should find myself, within a very short time, about 50 miles from the turbulent city, and hovering over a region of country as little like the civilized emporium just quitted as it is well possible to conceive. Not being a crow, however, nor fitted with an apparatus for flying, destitute even of a balloon, I am compelled to adopt the means of locomotion which the bounty of God or the ingenuity of man affords me, and to spend a somewhat longer time in transit to my destination. Over the New Jersey Railroad, then, I rattled, one fine sunshiny autumn morning, in the year that has recently taken leave of us, as far as Bordentown, a distance of some 57 miles, on my way to a locality the very existence of which is scarcely dreamed of by thousands in the metropolis, who could tell you how many square miles of malaria there are in the Roman Campagna, and who have got the topography of the Kaffirland at their fingers' ends. It is a region aboriginal in savagery, grand in the aspects of untrammeled nature, where forests extend in uninterrupted lines over scores of miles, where we may wander a good day's journey without meeting half a dozen human faces, where stately deer bound across our path and bears dispute our passage through the cedar brakes, where, in a word, we may enjoy the undiluted essence, the perfect wildness of woodland life. Deep and far under the shade of melancholy bough we shall be taken, if together we visit the ancient pines of New Jersey.
It's really good, isn't it?
Yeah, I like this one a lot.
I really like the writing. I love the no restraint, the breaks don't work, indulgent, just recklessly ornate, old school magazine style.
Yeah, really fun travelogue, this whole thing.
Yeah, there's just so much joyful playfulness in the overcooked curlicued sentences.
Mm-hmm.
Why say as the crow flies when you could just rattle on about having the faculty of flying with that swift directness which is proverbially attributed to the Corvine tribe. It's really fun.
It's like when you go buy like a $23 cheeseburger, and it's a cheeseburger, but it's super elevated and fancy, and there's a fun indulgence to it.
Yeah. The very next paragraph, there's that beautifully tortured metaphor where he compares the state of the roads in New Jersey to the political situation in France.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite parts.
Treacherous stretch of sand into which the wheels sink deeper and deeper at every revolution, as if the vehicle were France and the road disorder.
Yeah, that's been stuck in my head all day.
All right, so what you've been reading from is an article titled In the Pines that was published in the May 1859 issue of the Atlantic Monthly. And thank you for that delightful rendition, Sean. I actually envy your radiophonic voice.
Oh, thank you.
You're obviously familiar with The Atlantic, right?
Yeah.
Today, The Atlantic is one of America's oldest literary publications. Then it was one of its youngest. It was founded in 1857. You'll find this bemused travelogue of a cosmopolitan's visit to the backwoods of New Jersey, embedded among lots of poetry and some other overwritten travelogues. And a lot of it is actually really good. Plus, there's transcribed Revolutionary War correspondence, new fiction from Harriet Beecher Stowe, and some of that smug, concerned editorializing about where America is headed that continues to be the magazine's stock in trade today.
The problem of John Brown.
So, Sean, I asked you to read this article in preparation for today's episode. In addition to entertaining garden path sentences, I think you'll agree that it also has a bunch of really interesting observations about the Jersey Pine Barrens as they appeared to its author when he visited in 1858.
Yeah, it paints a very vivid and captivating picture.
Mm-hmm. But the real reason, though, why we're talking about this old magazine piece is because it contains what is almost certainly the earliest surviving written reference to the creature that haunts those woods. Here, finally, the Jersey Devil will make his appearance. This is The Devil You Don't, Part 2, A Star-Bespangled Pond in Some Silent Recess. I'm Dylan Ferguson. With me is Sean O'Rourke again. Hey, Sean.
Hey, Dylan.
As was common in those days, In the Pines was published without an author's name attached. But it's since been determined that it came from the pen of one William Frederick Myers. W.F. Myers, as he styled himself, wasn't just putting on airs when he adopted the perspective of a well-traveled citizen of the world. He was born in Tasmania and studied in Marseille before moving to New York City to become a journalist. He would have been in his late 20s at that point, but by the time the issue hit newsstands, he was already off on another adventure, on a ship journeying across the Pacific, headed for China, where he would remain for the rest of his life, holding consular positions in Guangzhou, Shanghai, and Beijing, eventually becoming one of the period's preeminent sinologists, or Western China experts. Now, I just called this the earliest appearance of our beautiful boy in print. So I should acknowledge that many sources, including the definitive Jersey Devil books by James McCloy and Ray Miller, which I'll be mentioning later, actually identify the earliest written reference to the Jersey Devil as a diary entry from 1790, so 70 years earlier. This diary was supposedly written by a woodsman named Vance Larner, who described the beast as a sort of flying moose man he encountered in a swamp. However, nobody seems to have been able to find an original source for this supposed diary, so it's almost certainly a hoax. We're talking about cryptids here, so part of the fun, but also the challenge of doing cryptid research is that piles and piles of poorly sourced claims tend to get indistinguishably slopped together with the Petacrete historical records, and endless uncritical recopying of earlier sources generates a murky mess of dubious stories that it gets really difficult to parse. But I think I can say without error that any alleged written account of the Jersey Devil said to predate the Myers Atlantic piece from 1859 is almost definitely fake. Of course, asserting that this is the earliest surviving written account is definitely not the same thing as saying that belief in the creature doesn't predate the Myers piece. As we're about to see, knowledge of the devil was being spoken of as something already at least 100 years old by that point. Oral traditions agree with this evidence that the Jersey Devil has been a subject of conversation and fear since the 1700s, and there's no reason to dispute that. And there may well have once been earlier writings about the devil, it just doesn't seem likely that anything pre-1859 has survived into our time. With that out of the way, let's return to W.F. Myers' In the Pines. Before we get to hear the story of the devil, we meet the storytellers. And Myers is less than gracious in his account of them. We first encounter the residents of the Pine Barrens while Myers is discussing the cranberry industry that has taken hold there.
All right. The cranberry cultivator has one enemy, which is neither bird, nor worm, nor blight, but biped, a rat, two-legged, erect, or moderately so, talking even in audible and intelligible speech. The pine rat, namely. Few but New Jerseymen, and of them chiefly those who dwell about the forest, have heard of this human species. It has not yet had its Agassiz nor its Wyman, yet there it flourishes and repeats itself. My friend, Mr. B., considerably undertook to initiate me into some of the mysteries of this race, which has proved minatory though not destructive to his blushing crop, and accordingly led me through brake and briar, past wild and gloomy cedar swamps, over brooks insecurely bridged with fallen logs, or, perchance, with stepping blocks of pine stumps, far into the silent forest, and to a little dell or dingle, a natural clearing, where a couple of tents were pitched, and the smoke of a struggling fire told infallibly of human neighborhood. The barking of a splenetic little terrier brought from one of the tents a man of some 50 years, lank and gaunt of visage, with matted hair and wild, uncivilized eyes, dressed in a ragged jacket and what had once been a pair of trousers. His face wore no expression of intelligence, but a look of intense, though animal cunning lurked in his eyes. While I was gazing on this individual, who stood in silence by his tent, there emerged from the other an ancient female, who might have been 80 years of age, but who hobbled towards us with much briskness.
So this funny cosmopolitan New York transplant with his ornate sentences suddenly feels kind of less charming by this point, doesn't he? Like, I mean, there's no way around it.
Yeah.
He's being super condescending and just mean-spirited.
So is this the beginning of the Atlantic tradition of sending like a coastal elite into real America to gawk at the hillbillies?
There is like 3 different articles in this issue that are basically that. I think it's a long-standing tradition for the magazine.
It's nice to know that some things don't change.
Yeah. Before we go much further, I think I need to gingerly introduce a term. So for a long time, the people who live in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey have been referred to as Pineys. It's a loaded term, and that's why I use it with hesitation. Many people from the region have come to consider the word a slur. Not without very good reason. Myers was certainly not the first or the last visitor to treat these people awfully. And it gets worse. I'm getting ahead of myself, but tune in next week to find out just how much worse.
Oh boy.
At the same time, many locals have decided to reclaim the term, and shirts that bear the slogan Piney Pride have been popular in the region since at least the 1990s. As someone who was born in Newfoundland, the usage debate feels kind of familiar to me unless I'm misreading it. Like a vocal minority of Newfoundlanders think the term Newfie should be stricken from our vocabulary because of its derogatory history, but many others wear it proudly, and I think a majority are fine just using context clues and common sense and don't really give a shit about academic usage debates. In any event, I've decided I'm not going to outright avoid the troubled term piney, but I'll try to use it sparingly and only in appropriate context.
Is there a New Jersey equivalent to Stompin' Tom that has a delightful song using the term?
I will have to look into that. I would not be surprised, though.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
But Myers goes with a term that, you don't have to have read a dissertation about the history of intra-New Jersey discrimination to understand that pine rats is a fucking insulting thing to call people. Especially surrounded by these like gross jokes about them being like a separate, not quite human race.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, his discriminatory jibes might actually be even worse than they look at first glance. When he says of this group, it has not yet had its Agassiz nor its Wyman, he's referring to prominent American scientists of the time who developed theories about the development of different species. Like it's a joke, but his line is also a window into the era's messy attempts to understand speciation and evolution, concepts that were still very much in their infancy at this time. The bombshell publication of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species was still 6 months away, and the different competing theories that were being bandied about in the meantime often had thorny implications. As for the 2 scientists Myers refers to, Jeffries Wyman believed in transcendental anatomy, which is the discredited idea that nature searches for ideal structures under divine initiative, and Louis Agassiz believed in polygenism, the also discredited and obviously super problematic idea that different human races are separate species with different origins. So Myers is making a joke, but it's an obviously barbed joke with some potentially sinister beliefs behind it. It's not cute. He's being a prick.
Yeah, I did not know that context reading this. It comes off as ugly, like the way that like a lot of people speak of Roma people, similar to that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I didn't know the specific reference to the scientists.
Mm-hmm. But anyway, let's hold our noses at the smirking urbanites attitude for a little bit and press forward into the article.
Mr. B whispers, "That's the queen of the pine rats!" The man whom we had first seen held in his hand a tattered shawl, with which he now began patching a portion of his tent, saying at the same time that there was a storm a-brewing. "Aye, is there?" said Mrs. Butler, "and a storm like the one when I seed at Leeds Devil." "Hush!" interrupted her ragged companion, with a look of terror. "What's the good of naming him and all yous talking about him when yer don't know her as he aren't beside ye?" "How devil yer!" shrieked the crone through a half-eaten tomato. "Finish mending up your cover, yer mean cranberry thief!" The spiteful terrier, which had meanwhile evinced an unpleasant interest in the thickness of my pantaloons, added his yelping to the clamour, and Mr. B, pointing to the clouds, thought we had better hasten homewards.
Thank you, Sean. And sorry about making you read those uncharitable attempts at transcribing dialect.
I love when people try to transcribe like phonetic dialect because I think it's usually a good way to sort of find oral posture or how you'd go around it. But this one's very strange. Like,
Yeah. Anyway, here's where I should remind our listeners that for most of its history, the Jersey Devil was known as the Leeds Devil. In the previous episode, we discussed how the Leeds name became associated with devilry during colonial times. Now, through the transubstantiation of folklore, we see that the Leeds Devil has become the name of a creature or demon, one apparently well known to the people living in the Pine Barrens. But Myers is an outsider, so naturally he's eager to ask his friend about what this all means. But first, they have to get home, which they endeavor to do as the storm gathers around them.
in the twinkling of an eye, the western horizon was overhung with the same ghastly storm bank that threatened in the east, while a monitory gust rustled through the sighing pines, wildly twisting and tossing the undergrowth, overspread with a quivering pallor as it bent before the breeze, and bade us be prepared. Next moment, a clap of thunder, rattling like the artillery of 10,000 sieges. Simultaneously, a flash of purple lightning fell from the zenith to the horizon, splitting the clouds asunder, and with it there descended rain in a cataract rather than in torrents, so that in the twinkling of an eye the thirsty sand was saturated, and bubbling pools of water pattered in the deluged path. Crash after crash, each clap more terrific than the one preceding, came the awful thunder. Blinding flashes of lightning darted around us, but still our phlegmatic ponies galloped on, and only once started violently, when a peal, which really seemed as if its shock must burst the heavens asunder, dazed us momentarily with its almost unendurable sound. The gloomy canopy above us, meanwhile, was overrun by incessant streams of purple lightning, and the deluge of rain still fell. At length we reached the big house.
There, as they dry themselves by the fireplace, while the storm continues to crash and howl outside, Myers asks his friend the question that's been gnawing at him.
And now, something about Leeds Devil, I said to my friend. I will answer. I will tell you, replies Mr. B. There lived, in the year 1735, in the township of Burlington, a woman. Her name was Leeds, and she was shrewdly suspected of a little amateur witchcraft. Be that as it may, it is well established that one stormy, gusty night, when the wind was howling in turret and tree, Mother Leeds gave birth to a son, whose father could have been no other than the Prince of Darkness. No sooner did he see the light than he assumed the form of a fiend, with a horse's head, wings of a bat, and a serpent's tail. The first thought of the newborn Caliban was to fall foul of his mother, whom he scratched and bepommeled soundly, and then flew through the window out into the village, where he played the mischief generally. Little children he devoured, maidens he abused, young men he mauled and battered, and it was many days before a holy man succeeded in repeating the enchantment of Prospero. At length, however, Leeds's devil was laid, but only for 100 years. During an entire century, the memory of that awful monster was preserved, and as 1835 drew nigh, the denizens of Burlington and the Pines looked tremblingly for his rising. Strange to say, however, no one but Hannah Butler has had a personal interview with the fiend, though since 1835 he has frequently been heard howling and screaming in the forest at night, to the terror of the rats in their lonely encampments. Hannah Butler saw the devil one stormy night long ago, though some skeptical individuals affirm that very possibly she may have been led, under the influence of liquid Jersey lightning, to invest a pine stump or possibly a belated bear, with diabolical attributes and a satanic voice. However that may be, you cannot induce a rat to leave his hut after dark, nor indeed will you find many Jerseymen, though of a higher order of intelligence, who will brave the supernatural terrors of the gloomy forest at night, unless secure in the strength of numbers.
Boom. There you have it. A version of the traditional origin story, and some mention of classic Leeds Devil characteristics: a beast with a reptilian tail, a horse's head, and bat wings, and the mention that it's often heard howling horribly in the woods. Ask somebody in this region of New Jersey to tell you about the Jersey Devil today, and there's a good chance they'll recount something similar. The legend has changed very little over time. And also that phrase, "he played the mischief generally," is another one that's really
Yeah.
stuck in my head. That's what I'm going to call it when I get too drunk on a night out now.
That and the word bepommeled.
Be pummeled soundly. Yeah.
Yes. Like, just, I love that it seems very 1800s to like just put be in front of a verb
Yeah.
in a past tense.
Yeah.
Like, and bepommeled soundly just so lovely. It feels good to say.
It does. If the description of the devil hasn't changed much, neither really has the dismissals of the skeptics. If you were curious about that reference to Jersey lightning, that's another term for Applejack.
Mhm.
Do you know what Applejack is, Sean?
It's like a hooch, right? Like a moonshine?
Yeah,
Or
yeah. It's a type of moonshine or brandy that's obviously made from apples, and it's also known as Jersey lightning. So residents of the Pine Barrens
Huh.
were known to brew a lot of moonshine, so these kinds of snarky references come up all the time in these accounts.
Hmm.
Now that we've arrived here, we can finally ask the burning question. What the fuck is a Jersey Devil? Well, the Leeds Devil or Jersey Devil is usually today lumped into the category cryptid, a creature not described by science but proposed to exist, like the Loch Ness Monster. That framing didn't exist yet in the mid 1800s. To try to understand how the Leeds Devil was seen in the 1800s, let's look at some of the earliest known newspaper accounts of sightings from a bit later, near the end of the century. In the January 22nd, 1893 edition of the New York Sun, you find an account under the mysterious headline, "The Engineer Quit His Run." An engineer running a train on the Erie Railroad, which used to be a rail line connecting New York to Chicago, claimed that his car was attacked by a flying creature. The only description that he gives is that the face was like that of an ape or monkey. Simian descriptions of the devil, which don't quite jive with the more famous accounts, are actually pretty common. The newspaper notes that when someone suggested to this engineer that he had been startled by an owl, he angrily retorted, by words censored by the newspaper, "That hain't no owl, that's the Leeds Devil, back again sure as you're livin'." Another cool account can be found in the Akron Daily Democrat, August 5th, 1899. We're talking Akron, Ohio. You'll find it on this great 2-page spread of fantastical stories mixed with the fantastically mundane, with startlingly good illustrations. Nestled among bizarre headlines, like "Samoan Joan of Arc, fair Suena, killed the dog which augured victory," and "Spuds and bacon,
What?
good enough for millionaire Healy of New Mexico," and my personal favorite, "Pa foozles badly. Georgie's dad makes another sad exhibition of himself." You'll find an article called...
What does that mean?
I'm still not sure, and I've read it.
Okay.
Some of these articles are very, very strange. But then there's one of them on this page that's called "Jersey Sees a Devil. Leeds Monster Reappears Among the Pines." This is an account of travelers coming upon the beast, and it retells another version of the Mother Leeds origin story. It also includes the bit about it having been banished for 100 years, and it gives some new powers and behaviors to the devil, which hadn't appeared in print before.
It turned the milk sour, lamed horses in their stalls, dried up the cows, made sere the Indian corn growing in the fields. Where the pines line the seashore, it flitted from one desolate grass-grown dune to another, watchful upon those wild nights when merchant ships, driving their prows into the sand, burst asunder and distributed their freight of costly goods and human souls upon the relentless waves. At other times, Leeds's devil, like a bird of prey, hovered over a silent, star-bespangled pond in some silent recess of the cedar swamps, blasting with its foul breath the lives of hundreds of fishes, found floating next day upon the surface, tainted and unfit for food. Again, the dreaded fiend half ran, half flew through the shadowy vistas of the pines, while before it to their coverts hurried panther and deer, rabbits, squirrels, and wild songbirds.
This one's good. I really like the writing in this one. That bit about the Star-Bespangled Pond, very poetic stuff.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. As like a side note, it's ecologically interesting that the article mentions panthers as being among the startled fauna of the pines, since it's generally agreed upon by scientists that mountain lions, aka panthers or cougars or catamounts, were extirpated from New Jersey in the 1830s or 1840s, part of a wave of extinction that entirely wiped out the eastern mountain lion, a proposed subspecies. Then again, maybe this writer in Akron just didn't know what the fuck he was talking about and was guessing about the fauna in New Jersey. As
Mhm.
for the description of the Leeds Devil, we get not only a familiar account by now, horse's head, serpent's tail, bat wings, but a really incredible illustration too of a flying horse dragon scaring the hat off a poor traveler. A really evocative image, beautifully done by whichever talented illustrator was grinding it out for the Akron Daily Democrat. So we can see that reports of the Leeds Devil that made it into the papers in the late 1800s sync up relatively well with the story told to W.F. Myers in 1858. But why were these stories starting to circulate, and why were newspapers picking up on them? To answer that, we need to look into what happened to the Pine Barrens in the 1800s. Let's return to In the Pines one last time to see how Myers ends his travelogue.
There must be no vagrants, not even in the forest, the once free and merry greenwood, our policeman civilization says. Nay, the forest even must keep a moving. We must have farms here, and happy homesteads, and orchards heavy with promise of cider, and wheat golden as hope, instead of silent aisles and avenues of mournful pine trees, sheltering such forlorn miscreations as our poor cranberry stealing friends. There is no room for a gypsy in all our wide America. The rat must follow the Indian, must fade like breath from a window pane in winter. In fact, the forest, left so long in its aboriginal savagery, is about to be regenerated. A railroad is to be constructed this year, which will place Hanover and the center of the forest within 1 hour's travel of Philadelphia. And it is scarcely too much to anticipate that within 5 years, thousands of acres, now dense with pines and cedars of 100 rings, will be laid out in blooming market gardens and in fields of generous corn. 5 years hence, bears and deer will be a tradition, panthers and raccoons a myth, partridges and quails a vain and melancholy recollection, in what shall then be known as what was once the pines.
So here's the twist. Myers, who, as I mentioned, was somewhere in the Pacific Ocean on a ship headed for China when this article was published, was wrong about all that. His confident
Hmm.
prediction was wrong. I guess he was right about the panther disappearing, even though, as I mentioned, it's thought that Jersey's mountain lions were already gone by then, though the more late 1800s accounts I find that mention panthers in the pines, the more I start to wonder if it isn't the scientists who are mistaken about that. But he was wrong about the rest. So these past months, I've been reading many accounts of the Pine Barrens written over the course of 300 years, and they all generally have a couple things in common. One, as I mentioned at the top of the first episode, is that almost all these written accounts need to point out how bizarre and unlikely it is that this huge stretch of woodlands can be found where it is, in the middle of one of the most populated regions on Earth. But the other thing they almost all say is that this woodland is on the verge of disappearing, since in this modern age, and all living people, of course, are always living in a perpetual modern age, the wheels of progress are about to run over the pines any day now. This forest is almost always presented as being glimpsed for one last time, one last melancholy glance over the writer's shoulder, right before the inexorable gears of urban modernity grind it underfoot. And every time, the author was proved wrong. The sparsely inhabited Pine Barrens somehow always remain, and always remain wild. In fact, Myers had been visiting the Pine Barrens shortly after it reached a peak in population and industry. For the rest of the 1800s, the region would experience not a florescence of cities and farms, as he predicted, but an increasing loss of people and jobs. So, who were the people in the Pine Barrens, and who stuck around? In the previous episode, we learnt a bit about the English Quakers and other European settlers who tried to found towns around the forested regions already inhabited to some limited degree by the Lenape First Nations. We got a peek at the religious and social life of Burlington, the capital of what was then called West Jersey. By the way, today people don't talk about West Jersey and East Jersey. They talk about North Jersey, where residents tend to cheer for New York sports teams, and South Jersey, where residents tend to cheer for Philadelphia sports teams.
Yeah, I think of it as Philip Roth, New Jersey, and Bruce Springsteen, New Jersey.
Oh, that's good. I like that.
Yeah.
But the disputed imaginary boundaries of North and South Jersey do seem to overlap to a large, if contentious, degree with the former boundaries of West and East Jersey. Anyway, whatever burgeoning urban and intellectual life there was in Burlington in the time of Daniel Leeds and Caleb Pussy, it didn't last long. Many of the children of those early dreamers left to America's fast-growing cities, mostly to Philadelphia, because it was right next door. Today, the tiny town of Burlington is considered a suburb of Philadelphia. As we glimpsed earlier, many of those who remained in the woods were religious freaks or cultists. Though some early colonial families did stick around, including the Leeds. A Leeds descendant would go on to found Atlantic City, and there are still Leedses in the area today. As for the Lenape, relations soured between them and the Europeans. While William Penn, the wealthy Quaker who once held grants for both West Jersey and Pennsylvania, was said to have treated the Lenape fairly, after William's death, his less scrupulous sons got greedy. In 1737, the Penn heirs claimed that a 1686 deed of dubious origin, which may have been a forgery, gave them the rights to the land extending from a certain point in the Delaware River to as far west as a man could walk in a day and a half. The Lenape reluctantly agreed to honor this, under the impression that the length that a man could walk in a day and a half through a forested area indicated a couple dozen miles. But the provincial secretary of Pennsylvania arranged for a cleared trail to be prepared, then hired the 3 fastest runners in the colony to do a relay, covering 70 miles. The Lenape felt like they'd been duped. They pled their case to the Iroquois Confederacy, also known as the Six Nations, which was arguably the most powerful empire on the continent at the time. But the Iroquois, who were no great friends of the Lenape and had an alliance in place with the English at the time, refused to help. The Lenape then petitioned the British government in London, but their case was dropped. So while some of them, especially the prominent leader Tediusgung, known to Europeans as King of the Delawares, continued to argue for justice, many Lenape relocated to the Pine Barrens as a last resort. The Lenape have actually never stopped fighting against this land grab, by the way. As recently as 2004, their case was heard by a U.S. District Court in Pennsylvania. It was dismissed, and to this day, the U.S. Supreme Court continues to refuse to hear their case. Following their expulsion from much of Pennsylvania, Lenape refugees were granted rights to a section of the Pine Barrens they had fled to in 1758, with the establishment of the first Indian reservation in the Americas.
Oh.
This novel arrangement was part of the Treaty of Easton, an attempt to resolve the so-called French and Indian War. That's what you call the North American theater of the 7 Years' War. A multifaceted conflict that involved primarily the French, the English, the Iroquois, and many other nations on the continent, including the Shawnee, the Wyandots, and the Lenape. The Lenape leader Tediusgung was a prominent and eloquent negotiator at the conference that ended with the ratification of the Treaty of Easton. But the resulting reservation in the Pines, called Brotherton, didn't last long and the community collapsed. Most of the Lenape accepted their situation and joined the westward migrations of First Nations peoples, resettling to the other side of the Appalachian Mountains, as the eastern seaboard of America continued to swell with more and more English settlements. Some of them now patrolled by openly genocidal militias. Today, a village called Indian Mills can be found where America's first reservation once stood. It's named after an old windmill the Lenape built and left behind. In 1763, Tediuscung, who refused to leave Pennsylvania and continued to agitate for Lenape rights, was burned to death in his house by unidentified arsonists.
Jesus.
In Meyer's article, he writes of the Pine residents in the mid-1800s. This extraordinary race of beings are lineal descendants of the New Jersey Tories, who, during the Revolution, made the pines their refuge, whence they sallied in perpetual forays against the farms and dwellings of the partisans of the opposite cause. In other words, he claims that people loyal to the British monarchy hid out in the pines in the years of the American Revolution in order to hide from, but also attack, the revolutionaries, and that it was their descendants who could be found living there in his time. Since Myers clearly disdains the people he met in the pines, it's pretty convenient for him to claim that they're all the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of traitors to the American cause. But there's probably some degree of truth in the story he tells. Regional family oral traditions often identify their ancestors as Tories, though some claim to have spread it from Whigs, those who supported independence, while others claim to be the descendants of Hessians, which is to say German soldiers, who were enlisted to fight the Americans on behalf of the British. For whatever various reasons, escaping the war, escaping hostile neighbors, or becoming stranded in a new land after arriving as a soldier of fortune, it seems that a good number of Europeans resettled in the mostly desolate Pine Barrens during the time of the American Revolution. And it was largely their descendants, living in small villages or isolated homesteads, who continued to persevere there, developing a unique way of life. The streams that run through the Pine Barrens are all outflowing, meaning that they originate from rain within the forest and flow out into the Atlantic Ocean to the southeast, or in some cases into the Delaware River to the west. Water doesn't run through the pines, in other words, only out of it. If you were to look at one of these streams flowing past you in the woods on a sunny day, you might notice a rusty color, maybe a bit of a reflective film, winking back at you in flashes of purple and blue, almost like there was a thin slick of oil on the surface of the water. That's not quite what it is. See, rainwater, once it's passed through the Pine Barrens' sandy, aluminum-heavy soil, becomes acidic enough that it actually leaches iron out of the earth. This dissolved iron then runs into the streams, and it oxidizes upon contact with the surface. Then the iron oxide film gets washed up on the edges of the streams, concentrating over time into banks of iron-rich sandstone deposits. These deposits are known as bog iron, and harvesting them from the banks of swamps and streams provided the raw material for the first real industry in the region. Cutting down pine wood to make charcoal for big fires, then collecting seashells on the coast for use as flux to encourage melting, Pine Barrens entrepreneurs were able to build open-air furnaces and forges, which they used to smelt the bog iron into cannonballs. Loads and loads of cannonballs were sent out of the forest in wagons pulled along sugar sand paths by unfortunate horses, and these missiles fed the cannons of the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and the First Barbary War, when America sent ships to attack pirates in North Africa. During peacetime, these ironworks converted to making nails, kettles, and parts for sugar mills and steamboats. In the early 1800s, massive deposits of iron ore and coal were discovered in western Pennsylvania, and high-quality pig iron began to be produced on a large scale in Pittsburgh, destroying the demand for Jersey's lower-quality bog iron. When Myers visited the Pines, the last large-scale ironworks had only recently been shut down, and he tours its remains as they begin to be reabsorbed by the forest. With the loss of the ironworks, some people did try to set up other industries in the pines, but they never really took off. Mostly these revolved around using the abundant trees. Cedar was sold to make shingles and cabinets. The desk upon which Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence was made by a Pine Barrens woodworker. When all else fails, the trees could be turned into charcoal. Sometimes charcoal buyers would start forest fires on purpose. Once the trees had been burned, they were only good for charcoal, so they'd be sold to the crafty charcoal buyers. There were a couple attempts to take advantage of this abundant fuel by building glassworks. A glass jar with a threaded lid was first created in the Pines in 1858, the same year Myers visited, by an enterprising Jersey tinsmith, John Landis Mason, the world's first mason jar.
Huh.
But none of the attempts to start a glass industry lasted very long. Of course, not everyone was waiting around for a legal means of making a living. The fact that it was so easy to hide out in these dense, sparsely populated woods made them attractive to criminals. Pirates used to hang out there. They'd attack and seize British ships off the coast, then drag the hulls into the forest where they'd pull them apart so they could salvage the good bits of wood and hide any trace of their actions. Some say that you can still occasionally find the timbers of old 18th century vessels submerged in the creeks. Gangs of robbers used to stalk the woods too. They were known as the Pine Robbers or Pine Banditti, and when they got too troublesome, the small communities would form vigilante posses to hunt them down. And then there were the cranberries. Cranberries grow wild all over the Pine Barrens, and people realized that if they build dikes around swamps on their land, they could encourage huge crops of the wetland shrubs to grow in the shallow, still waters. In Myers' article, the friend he's visiting, Mr. B, is a cranberry farmer. Cranberry bogs have provided temporary employment during the harvesting season for 200 years now. But for generations, many of the people who lived in the New Jersey Pine Barrens didn't have any fixed employment at all. They just lived their lives. Deer and rabbit are readily available to anyone with a rifle. And while New Jersey hunting laws have long been strict, the Pine residents have anecdotally often regarded those laws as important regulations for outsiders, but not applicable to themselves. And in addition to maybe selling a little charcoal or cordwood on the side, some locals got into the foraging game, finding different things to sell at different times of the year. For a long time at the start of spring, people would go out into the lowland forests to gather sphagnum moss. Sphagnum is an extremely spongy and absorbent moss, and it remains that way for a very long time after being harvested, thanks to a unique cellular structure that allows it to retain water long after death. This sphagnum moss was sold to florists because it was the perfect material to stick the stems of flowers into, like at the base of a bouquet. It holds the stem in place, it provides a little packet of water to nourish the flowers, and it's somewhat antibacterial, guarding the cut part of the stem against infection. At times, sphagnum moss has been used to dress wounds. It was used for this during the American Revolution and during World War I, because it's malleable, anoxic, and bacteria-resistant. There's not much of a market for it these days, though. Florists now prefer to stick their flowers in manufactured plastic vases. In December, people would cut down pine trees, as well as holly and mistletoe, and send them by wagon to New York City, where they'd be sold as Christmas decorations. The Christmas season was also a good time for pine ballers, those who collect pine cones, who like to work in the dwarf plains, because it's easy to quickly pick trees clean when they're only 4 feet tall and you can lean over them. The stems of laurel trees were sold to be used as pipe stems, and wild indigo was sold to be used as a dye or as an ingredient in medicine. Some of the beautiful flowers that grow wild in the woods, rhododendron, orchids, trailing arbutus, gentian, swamp pinks, wild magnolias, azaleas, were tenderly gathered and carted off to grateful florists in the cities. At one point, there was a market for capturing live box turtles, which people in Philadelphia liked to place in their cellars, where the turtles would get rid of their snails.
I've never heard of using turtles as pest control before. That's delightful.
No, me either. It sounds great. And so with little industry or money coming in, families and solitary hermits continued to live in tiny communities with colorful names like Mount Misery, Woodmansey, Double Trouble, Chicken Bone, Ong's Hat, and Hog's Wallow. The histories of many of these vanishing little towns were described by Henry Charlton Beck a journalist, folklorist, and Episcopal minister who visited what remained of them in the early 1900s. Whatever social life there might have been in the Pines was often centered around the disparate taverns. They called these jug taverns because the regulars would have to trek a ways to get there, so they'd take advantage of their visit to fill up their liquor jugs. If you sidled up to the bar of a Pines jug tavern in the 1800s, you might be offered a mug of metheglin, that's mead mixed with water and herbs, or cider royale, which is just really strong apple cider, or mimbo, which is rum and water mixed with unrefined muscovado sugar. And if that doesn't already sound like a great way to spend an afternoon, you might also be treated to one of the local tall tales as recounted by a passing regular. The Pine Barrens have long been known for their raconteurs. As New Yorker staff writer John McPhee wrote in his wonderful 1967 book, The Pine Barrens, which I've leaned on heavily for this section, quote, "The general art of storytelling was once of enough importance in the Pine Barrens to give rise to a class of local homers, some of whom did nothing at all but travel through the woods telling tales." Consequently, many well-worn legends have circulated for centuries, like Sammy Gibberson's air tune, an indescribable and maybe inaudible fiddle melody so beautiful that Sammy used it to beat the devil himself. Or the one about Cracky Wainwright, who began to jump across the river and then, realizing halfway that he wasn't going to make it, turned around and jumped back because he didn't want to get his feet wet. So that's good fun. Some tales are more sinister, like the one about the pirate whom Captain Kidd beheaded because he helped bury Kidd's treasure and knew its location, or the mysterious omen called the Black Dog, or the golden-haired girl who stood in a white dress staring out after a boat that would never return, and still appears on stormy nights. Apparently, these spectral visitors sometimes keep one another company. The Black Dog, the ghost of the headless pirate, and the golden-haired girl have all been spotted hanging out with the most famous legendary Pines denizen. They have all been said to be friends with the Jersey Devil. By the way, Mimbo, not too bad. I'm having a little glass right now.
Oh, really? It does sound delicious. I love the name. I doubt it has the same connotation that I'm putting on it, but
What's the connotation you're putting on it?
well, like a himbo, but a different portmanteau.
Yeah.
A male bimbo.
Yeah, right.
Which is what, like, if I saw that on a menu, that's what I'm running to.
Yeah. So now that we know a little bit more about the people in the Pines, let's revisit the question of why this particular legend became something that American newspapers started picking up on in the late 1800s. To be clear, the Jersey Devil isn't just a story. Countless local people did and still do think it is a real thing, whatever else it might be. If you hear someone say that no one actually believes in the Jersey Devil, that it was made up either to keep people out of the Pines or, contradictorily, to draw tourists in, that person is wrong, just categorically. That much is clear from my research and just talking to Jerseyites. 100 years ago, 50 years ago, and today, belief in the being known as the Jersey Devil is real and strong. But still, why did these newspapers care? What was really the story here? To get a better idea, I want us to return to that May 1859 edition of The Atlantic, because this was really American literary culture at its highest level at the time. Like, this was the cutting edge stuff. Some of the most popular and influential American writers were joining this new magazine, you know? And what's interesting to me is that a lot of the themes you find in the Pines are repeated in other articles. As we've seen, Myers clearly has an affection for these untrammeled stretches of wilderness, aboriginal in its savagery, as he says, which were already being presented to American readers as a sort of relic, a remainder from another era. But at the same time, he clearly disdains the people who live in these woods, condescendingly representing them as uncivilized. So there's an almost paradoxical relationship between fetishizing life in the woods and vilifying the people who actually do live life in the woods. You could find this sort of thing in other places in the same magazine. There are articles about the attempts to conquer the mysterious Utah and New Mexico territories, regions that had just recently been added to the American Republic. And these accounts make it clear to what extent the national project of claiming Euro American control of the land from coast to coast was still at this point very much a work in progress, more ambition than reality. But reading this magazine, I was struck by how you keep encountering in successive articles this idea that we should be nostalgic about the woods themselves, which will apparently inevitably disappear in the name of progress. But that the people, whether First Nations or Spanish or the descendants of homesteaders who are already there, are somehow already unworthy of the land, unworthy of whatever tradition of Western civilization these writers all claim to vaguely be a part of. And everywhere there's breathless references to science, science as the American religion, science being called upon to justify all of these prejudicial beliefs, to give them the sheen of hard fact. We see to what extent the Enlightenment idea of a rational, fact-based society where everything can be described and controlled has crystallized and hardened for serious literary Americans. The article that comes right before In the Pines is a great example. It's called The Gymnasium, and it's about how America needs to take inspiration from the ancient Grecian educational tradition to build strong, manly citizens. The general ethos of the article will be familiar to anyone who has ever encountered like a Greek statue profile picture return to tradition account on social media. It's the well-worn idea that there's this thing called Western civilization, which comes down to us from the Greeks, and that it's somehow righteous and pure, and we need to like protect and uphold it. Historically, the idea is not very sound or logical, and in practice, it's usually just a vague framework for prejudice. But reading mid 1800s American writing makes it clear how important this idea was in literary urban circles at the time. So I want to quickly read a snippet from this strange article, The Gymnasium.
The western border states are noted for the production of a large and hardy race. New Hampshire and Vermont contribute a good share of the tall and well-developed men who yearly recruit the population of our eastern cities.
Okay, quick pause here to note how weird it feels to refer to the New England states of New
Yeah.
Hampshire and Vermont as western border states.
Yeah, I'm like trying to wrap my head around, because I guess this is the time when like Ohio was the wild western frontier.
Very much. Ohio was still very much indigenous territory at that point. They were trying to tame, as they would call it, sections of. It just underscores how unknown the interior of the continent still was at that point for people in the cities. I think for the urban society of New York and Boston at the time, Vermont and New Hampshire really were a backwoods frontier.
Right.
Okay, let's continue.
Let a generation pass, however, and we find the offspring of such sires with equally capacious frames, but far less muscular power. The skeleton is laid of a man mighty in strength, but the filling in is wanting. Broad-jointed bones swing listlessly in their sockets, the head projects, and the shoulders bend under the influence of a sedentary life. The laboring and mechanical classes bring certain groups of muscles to perfection in development and dexterity, but present few instances of an harmonious organization. Commercial and professional men do not accomplish even a limited muscular development. For the other sex, nature seems to have provided a certain immunity from the necessity of active exercise for the rounding and completion of their bodies. The lack of fresh air, however, soon tells them with a fatal story of fading complexions and departing bloom. That ethereal beauty which peculiarly marks the American woman is also the earliest to decay. As they are the prettiest, so are they the soonest passés of any northern nation. Could they but realize that exercise in the open air is nature's great and only cosmetic, the reproach of early old age would cease. Nothing will give that peach bloom to the cheek and that peculiar sweetness to the eye which a long walk through the fields of a clear October day bestows unbought.
All right, so I mean, kind of a creepy way to talk about people.
I love that the concern about computer neck is like 200 years old.
Yeah.
Leaving aside the weird, like, the sexist stuff, but
yeah.
I kind of agree with a little bit of it.
But in terms of like physical attributes that the writer pretends to have like a perfect scientific access to the meaning of,
Yeah.
um, it's a kind of thing that was actually common in writing of the time. So the writer also notes that the revival of the old country games of cricket and base-ball affords some of the best examples of a growing desire for athletic sports. He's worried that the loss of opportunities to exercise in the wilderness will be a problem for the new American race. He says that, quote, the suicidal war waged against trees and birds alike by the early settlers has left but little inducement to follow in this country the field sports so fashionable in England. So this stuff is actually pretty cutting edge for the time. We're seeing in the 1859 Atlantic early glimmers of an ethics whose popularity would explode in the years following the American Civil War of 1861 to 1865, which was just on the cusp of breaking out at this point. To be clear, American naturalism and environmentalism, though it wouldn't blossom until much later, had pushed up its first spring shoots even before the Civil War. Ralph Waldo Emerson had published his book Nature in 1836, suggesting that his fellow citizens strive to be a transparent eyeball content to absorb the beautiful world around themselves. And Henry David Thoreau, an acolyte of Emerson, had published Walden in 1855. But it was really after the Civil War when an explosion of post war industrialization transformed a nation of rural farmers into a constellation of crowded cities full of factory workers that America's obsession with nature really took off. This is sometimes called the nature boom. Earlier generations of Euro Americans had been kind of afraid of the great expanses of wilderness they encountered, a fear they imported with them from Europe. And this fear wasn't unreasonable. Fatal wolf attacks were surprisingly common in medieval and early modern Europe. The woods could kill you. And European colonists were also influenced by the First Nations people they encountered, who generally had a healthy sense of respect towards the potentially dangerous natural world. But as the nation's cities swelled with new arrivals and European immigrants, literary urban Americans began to celebrate the ideas of men like John Muir and Theodore Roosevelt, who preached a new conception of wilderness. To them, the woods and mountains and swamps were no longer something to be conquered and cleared or else avoided. They represented something important and essential to the human soul. They recognize that since when you're out in the woods, you can feel feelings and think thoughts that you just don't while you're in a human built urban environment, that we can't afford to just write off these spaces nostalgically as a necessary casualty of progress, that they have to be venerated, they have to be protected. And many people have since revisited and criticized the classic Muir-Roosevelt idea, pointing out how everything we call wilderness is almost always a human construction in some sense, how the uninhabited open spaces they loved were only uninhabited and open because of genocide, and how there's a reactionary racial element to this spiritual flight from the cities at a time when the cities were filling up with poor European immigrants from places like Ireland, southern Italy, and Eastern Europe, as well as Black people, the formerly enslaved, and their descendants.
And this would have been before the Irish and the Italians got to be white, right?
Yeah, I think so, or at least when they were
On the
in the
cusp.
on the cusp. Yeah, but still, this American ideal of wilderness as balm for the modern soul proved extremely popular. Remains extremely popular,
Hmm.
and it inspired the movement to create protected national parks, which is a truly American idea. As a result of John Muir's activism, United States President Ulysses S. Grant made Yosemite the world's first federally protected national park in 1872. And yet, still, revisit those pieces from the Atlantic, and you can see how bizarre the relationship between urban Americans and the people actually living in the woods is. There's a tension between the creepily overconfident scientific mindset and the more mystic romantic thoughts that this conception of wilderness inspired. As the culture becomes increasingly enamored with the idea of natural spaces, reconceiving woodlands as an essential playground for the soul and the proper environment for a healthy individual, they seem stuck on their weird colonial need for the woods to be empty of other people. They're clearly uneasy about the people living there. They find them degenerate, either laughable or scary or both. And I think this informs a lot of the growing fascination in places like New York and Akron with a story like the Jersey Devil, a creature that lives in an area close to major cities that nonetheless seems to be moving in the opposite direction from the rest of the nation. As Henry Charlton Beck, that chronicler of life in the Pine Barrens, wrote in 1936, "While the world outside has been growing up, this world inside has been growing down." There's the odd speculation about what might exist in those forested regions, increasingly remote for urban dwellers, but increasingly romanticized, combined with a snickering and somewhat horrified obsession with those weirdos out there and whatever weird things they might believe. In other words, the victory of Ben Franklin-style American rationalism was never complete or untroubled, not as long as this strange story persisted. And as the 1800s turned into the 1900s, the story would explode. Because after years of the Jersey Devil making an occasional appearance in a small newspaper article here or there, he would suddenly become a star. During one brief, incredible stretch, in the winter of 1909, the Jersey Devil began appearing all over. His antics began to be reported on across the country. Panic would set in New Jersey, and the flurry of sightings would end spectacularly, with the Jersey Devil captured and displayed in a cage. Next time, we welcome you to the phenomenal week, when the Jersey Devil finally shows his face. And we'll linger in the region to tell a shocking story that asks the immortal question, has science gone too far?
Oh, I can't wait.
I'm Dylan Ferguson.
I'm Sean O'Rourke.
Original music is by Rob Watt. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week on The Devil You Don't.